Texas. The sun beats down on endless cotton fields. A boy named Roy Benavidez walks barefoot along the dirt road, carrying a sack that weighs more than he does. His hands are blistered, his back aches, but he keeps moving. Life hasn't given Roy much. His father died of tuberculosis when Roy was just a child. His mother followed soon after. Orphaned, raised by relatives in a small, crowded house, Roy grew up in poverty that left no room for weakness. Childhood for him wasn't toys or games. It was labor, long days in the fields, odd jobs, anything to keep food on the table. But those years gave him something more valuable than comfort. They gave him toughness. The fields taught him patience. The sun taught him endurance. Every mile barefoot hardened his will. He learned early that life doesn't hand you anything. You take it step by step. Roy wasn't big. He wasn't the loudest. But he carried inside him a quiet belief. A man is not where he starts, but how far he's willing to go. At 17, he made a decision that would change everything. He enlisted in the United States Army. For the first time, someone handed him a uniform, cut his hair, put him in line with other men. He wasn't a farm boy anymore. He was a soldier in training. The Army gave him structure. It gave him purpose. And for Roy, that was enough. He didn't dream of medals or headlines. He wanted to serve, to prove himself, to carry his weight for something bigger than himself. What he didn't know was that his journey would carry him into jungles halfway across the world, that he would face wounds no man was expected to survive, that one day people would call him the man who refused to die. But all of that was far away. For now, Roy Benavidez was just a young soldier, standing at the start of a road that would test every ounce of grit he had. And in the silence of those Texas nights, one truth had already taken root in his heart. If you can take one more step, you're not finished. The Green Beret wasn't just a piece of cloth to Roy Benavidez. It was proof. Proof that a boy who had grown up barefoot in Texas cotton fields could stand shoulder to shoulder with America's finest. By the mid-1960s, he had found his tribe. The Army gave him order, and Special Forces gave him purpose. Every mile marched, every weapon drill, every brutal test of endurance. He took it all as if life had been preparing him since childhood. Then came Vietnam. The jungle was unlike anything he had ever seen. Heat that pressed against the skin like a weight. Humidity so thick it clung to the lungs. And an enemy that didn't play by familiar rules. Missions were small, surgical. Patrols slipped across borders at night, where every rustle could be an ambush, every shadow a trap. Roy learned quickly that success depended less on firepower and more on patience, teamwork, and discipline. But war has a way of testing resolve. On one mission, everything changed. A mine, a blast. The shockwave threw him to the ground, twisting his body into pain so sharp he could barely breathe. When the dust settled, Roy was no longer the unstoppable Green Beret. He was a broken man. Evacuated back to the United States, he woke beneath the harsh lights of a military hospital. Doctors spoke in tones more final than bullets. Severe spinal damage, nerve trauma. They told him plainly, "Sergeant Benavidez, you will never walk again." The Army began the paperwork, a medical discharge, a quiet exit. For many men that would have been the end of the story, but not for Roy. In those long nights at the hospital, he thought back to the cotton fields, to the orphan who carried loads heavier than himself, to the boy who learned that life never gave you mercy. He made a decision. If his body had quit, his will would not. So he began his private war. When the ward went silent and nurses had gone, he pulled himself from the bed. Fingers hooked onto railings, legs dangling uselessly at first. He tried to stand. He fell. Again and again, his body collapsed. His hands bled from gripping the bars, his knees bruised from striking the tile. Nurses found him sprawled on the floor and scolded him for risking more injury. But each night he tried again. Step, collapse, step, collapse again. Progress was invisible at first, but night after night, inch by inch, his muscles remembered. Nerves began to fire. The pain didn't vanish, but pain was something Roy already knew how to live with. From 2 steps to 5, from 5 to the length of the hallway. Months later, from the hallway to a staircase, and finally, unbelievably, to a jog. Doctors called it a miracle. Roy knew better. It was work. Quiet, stubborn work. When he could stand in uniform again, he made his request, "Return me to duty." The army resisted. The medical files said no. The logic said no. But Roy kept asking. He appeared in offices, reported for evaluations, proved with each movement that he was not a cripple, not a casualty. He was a soldier. Eventually, the army relented. Roy Benavidez was cleared to return to Special Forces. He had clawed his way back from a wheelchair to the ranks of the elite. For him, it wasn't about pride. It wasn't about revenge. It was about belonging. His brothers were still in the jungle, still bleeding, still calling for medics and covering each other in firefights. Roy could not live with himself watching from the sidelines. And so, against every odd, he returned to Vietnam, no longer the farm boy from Texas, no longer the patient in a hospital bed. He was a Green Beret once more, a man who had already faced the impossible and won. And deep down he knew the greatest test was still waiting. May 1968, the Central Highlands of Vietnam. The war has reached one of its most brutal phases. At dawn, a radio crackles with 2 words that freeze blood: prairie fire. That was the distress code for a team in mortal danger. A group of 12 Green Berets and their allies had been dropped near the Cambodian border. Now they were surrounded, hundreds of enemy troops closing in. Their odds of survival were shrinking by the minute. Roy Benavidez was off duty that morning. No rifle in hand, no mission orders. But the moment he heard the call, he knew. Those were his brothers out there. And if he didn't go, they would die. He grabbed what he could, a medic bag, a knife, extra ammo. No helmet, no rifle of his own. He sprinted to the landing pad and jumped onto the first helicopter heading out. He wasn't on the manifest. No one had asked him. He didn't care. As the Huey dropped into the landing zone, chaos swallowed everything. Bullets shredded the air. Smoke rose in thick black columns. Screams and gunfire merged into one terrible sound. The helicopter hovered just long enough. Roy leapt out, and almost immediately, a bullet tore into his leg. Most men would have stayed down. Roy pushed forward. He crawled through 50 yards of open field, dragging himself across dirt and grass, blood leaving a trail behind him. Explosions shook the ground. He kept moving. Step, drag, crawl, until finally he reached the wounded team. The sight was worse than he imagined. Men bleeding, men already gone, enemy forces pressing closer. Roy didn't hesitate. He went to work. He bandaged wounds, stopped bleeding, whispered words to keep men conscious. When bullets snapped too close, he grabbed a rifle and fired back. He was everywhere at once: medic, soldier, leader. He called in airstrikes, marked the zone for helicopters, and began dragging the injured to safety. A Huey touched down. Roy loaded the most critical men, then waved the bird off without climbing aboard. He wasn't leaving, not yet. Again and again he ran into enemy fire. He pulled men from ditches, carried them on his shoulders, dragged them across the ground. A grenade sent shrapnel ripping into his back and face. He kept moving. A bayonet tore into his arm during hand-to-hand fighting. He killed the enemy soldier and went back to carrying his brothers. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. The field became a graveyard of smoke and shell casings. Roy's uniform was soaked in blood. Some his, some not. By the time another helicopter came, he had already saved half the team. He could have left, but there were still men on the ground, so he stayed. At one point, he pulled a man to cover, only to feel another bullet tear through his stomach. The pain was blinding. He shoved it aside. He had no time for pain. Another man needed him. 6 hours. That's how long he fought. 6 hours of dragging, firing, bandaging, bleeding. 37 separate wounds marked his body. By the end, his vision blurred. His arms trembled. His pistol was down to its last magazine. Still, he stood guard, covering the evacuation until the last helicopter was loaded. Finally, when the bird lifted off, Roy collapsed inside. His body had nothing left. Blood pooled on the floor. His heart slowed. Soldiers thought he was gone. A doctor prepared a body bag, and then Roy spit in his face blood, but proof of life. He was still here, still refusing. 6 hours in hell. And he had walked out alive. The helicopter had barely touched down when the medics rushed Roy Benavidez inside. His uniform was soaked through with blood, his body torn open by bullets, shrapnel, and blades. 37 separate wounds. Surgeons worked without pause, cutting, stitching, transfusing. At one point, a priest was summoned. Last rites whispered over a man who refused to close his eyes. But Roy wasn't done. Not yet. He drifted in and out of consciousness for days. Every time he surfaced, there was a ceiling light above him, the sharp smell of antiseptic, and the steady beep of machines measuring the war still raging inside his chest. Nurses asked him questions, name, rank, unit. He forced answers through dry lips. As long as he could speak, he was alive. Recovery was not glamorous. It was months of infections, pain that clamped down like iron, and the slow humiliation of learning how to stand again with muscles that no longer obeyed. Some nights he thought back to the rice paddies, the smell of smoke, the weight of a comrade on his shoulders. He asked himself if it had been worth it. The answer always came the same. Yes. Every second. Every wound. Back at base, his actions became legend. But legends are messy things. Some soldiers swore he had carried half the team by himself. Others thought the stories were exaggerated. Reports conflicted. Witnesses had been killed. The truth was harder to prove than anyone expected. The army opened a file. Statements were collected. Interviews conducted. But paperwork moves slower than memory. For years, Roy lived in the shadow of disbelief. He didn't campaign for recognition. He didn't write letters. He simply endured, the same way he always had. Quiet, steady, waiting. And then, in 1981, 13 years after that morning in the jungle, the truth was finally given its voice. Survivors testified, pilots confirmed, the puzzle fit together. Washington, D.C., the White House. Roy stood in a dress uniform, scars hidden beneath the fabric, his posture stiff with pain but proud. President Ronald Reagan addressed the crowd. If the story of Roy Benavidez were a movie, no one would believe it. Then he placed the Medal of Honor around Roy's neck. The room erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. But Roy didn't see the ceremony as his. He saw it as theirs. The men who didn't come home, the brothers who had bled in the mud while he fought to carry them out. He accepted the medal not for glory, but as a marker that their story would not vanish. That day, Sergeant Roy Benavidez stepped across a line few ever cross. He was no longer just a soldier. He had become a living legend. And yet, when the crowd dispersed and the cameras faded, he was still the same man. Still the orphan boy from Texas who believed in one simple rule. If you can take one more step, you're not finished. After the ceremony, life didn't suddenly become easy. Roy Benavidez carried pain with him every day. His body bore the scars of 37 wounds, and each step was a reminder of what it had cost. But he carried it the same way he had carried his brothers in the jungle, with quiet determination and no complaints. He could have disappeared into the background, living off recognition and retirement. Instead, he chose something harder. He traveled, he spoke, he went to schools, bases, and hospitals, telling his story not to glorify himself, but to remind others of what a human being is capable of when he refuses to quit. He spoke in plain language, no drama, no polish, just the voice of a soldier who had seen hell and walked back. His message was always the same. You are not beaten when you fall. You are beaten when you quit. For young recruits, for struggling kids, for men and women who thought their fight was over, those words landed like fire. Roy became more than a war hero. He became a living example of resilience. To veterans wrestling with wounds both visible and hidden, he was proof that scars are not the end of the story. To students who thought their circumstances defined them, he was living evidence that strength comes from choice, not privilege. He never pretended to be perfect. He laughed, he joked, he admitted fear. But he always returned to the truth that had guided his entire life. You keep moving forward, one painful step at a time. Roy Benavidez died in 1998 at the age of 63. At his funeral, Green Berets stood shoulder to shoulder, saluting a man who had once been told he would never walk again. The flag draped over his coffin carried the weight of a nation's gratitude. But more important than the medals or ceremonies was the legacy he left behind. The legacy of a boy from the cotton fields who became the man who refused to die. His story is not about superhuman strength. It's about ordinary grit carried to extraordinary lengths. It's about the truth that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's action in spite of it. And it's about a simple rule that outlives any battle, any war, any man. If you can take one more step, you're not finished.